The most expensive thing I ever paid for was not legal counsel, not forensic software licenses, not 3 winters of hotel rooms near hearing calendars that moved without apology. It was the cost of being treated as decorative by people who shared my last name and called that arrangement tradition. My name is Haley Robinson, and this was the meeting where my sister tried to erase me in front of everyone who mattered. The Robinson Family Governance Summit sounded neutral on paper, almost sterile in its precision, but everyone in our orbit knew what it meant. It meant inheritance mechanics disguised as stewardship language. It meant seating maps that communicated rank more efficiently than any balance sheet. It meant the private client floor of Robinson Continental Bank emptied early so the elevator bank could be controlled, with security posted at both ends of the corridor and polished brass nameplates aligned like medals on the long walnut table. It meant our father's portrait moved from the lobby alcove to the conference room threshold for the day, so every person entering had to pass his painted eyes before taking a seat. I arrived 10 minutes before call to order and found my place already decided for me. The official minutes recorder had a fixed camera angled toward the centerline of the table, toward Vivian at the head position, toward the 2 outside counsel seats, and the independent fiduciary consultant she had insisted on hiring. Every principal stakeholder nameplate sat inside that frame, except mine. My plate had been moved 1 chair past the camera's right edge, near the climate vent where paper corners lifted in the draft. If I leaned forward to speak, only a slice of my shoulder would register on the recording. If I stayed still, the transcript could include my words while the visual record excluded my face. The choreography was meticulous, and that was the point. I touched the edge of the brass plate with 1 fingertip and felt the cool metal hold its temperature like a verdict. Haley, that placement keeps the line clear for the screen share, Vivian said behind me, already in command voice. Already making a technical reason stand in for a political choice. Her reflection appeared first in the glass wall, then her body, then the scent of cedar and expensive citrus that always arrived a second after she did. She wore charcoal with a narrow ivory blouse. No visible crease, no visible hesitation. Her tablet was open before she sat. Her legal tabs were color-coded. She did not look at me directly when she spoke the next sentence. Please don't improvise today. We need clean governance. Clean governance. In our family, clean had never meant honest. It meant unchallengeable. I sat where I had been placed and folded my hands so no one would see that my left thumb had begun its old, involuntary tap against my index finger, the rhythm my body chose when a room turned performative. Through the glass wall, the city looked hammered flat under a white afternoon sky. Down below, on the private client floor, I could see relationship managers in muted suits guiding wealth clients from espresso bar to consultation suite, each movement a soft transaction of reassurance. Up here, reassurance was for people who were already centered. At 2 p.m., the recorder light turned red. Our general counsel, Martin Hale, read opening formalities in his measured baritone. Conflict checks, attendance, agenda adoption, estate restructuring timeline under Article 12 of the Robinson Instrument, trust voting protocol, temporary transfer controls pending ratification. His diction carried the familiar neutrality of someone who had survived 2 decades by mistaking balance for fairness. My mother sat halfway down the left side of the table, pearls at her throat, posture impeccable, eyes lowered to a packet she did not turn. She had mastered the art of appearing present while declining to occupy any side. My Uncle Grant cleared his throat at intervals that implied concern without substance. 2 board observers from the foundation sat silent, pens poised, already learning which voices were expected to fill a room and which were expected to disappear inside it. Vivian moved to item 3 with a slight nod that functioned like a gavel. Before we proceed to vote sequencing, I need to note record integrity concerns. She said it calmly, almost regretfully, as if she were introducing weather. Martin looked up. State the concern. Vivian did not glance at me when she answered. Haley fabricates numbers when she feels excluded. Let the record show she is not a reliable witness. No one gasped. That is what years of conditioning buys you. Even cruelty arrives as procedure and is received as administrative business. My mother's hand paused over the packet margin. Uncle Grant looked toward the window. One observer shifted in his seat and then looked quickly at his notes. Martin's pen stopped for a beat, then resumed. I didn't argue. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend myself in that moment because I had sat through this conversion ritual too many times to misread it. In our governance rooms, outrage was treated as instability, instability as disqualification, and disqualification as objective necessity. A woman who answered an accusation with anger became the evidence for the accusation. A woman who answered with silence became a blank line available for others to fill. I had lived both outcomes. Neither one protected the truth. So, I watched. The wall clock above the far monitor ticked in quarter-second pulses. I marked each minute against the packet version time printed at the bottom of page 1. 13:42. Revision C, circulated by Vivian's office. I marked the sequence of who reached for which section first. Counsel to appendix, fiduciary to the transfer schedule, mother to summary language, uncle to signature page. I marked the point where Vivian's right hand moved to the tablet and then back to the paper set, and the point where the numbers in row 17 of the transfer timeline did not align with the metadata trail I had reviewed 48 hours earlier under read-only access. I did not need a raised voice to feel the floor tilt. I needed memory and pattern recognition, both of which had kept me employed in rooms where men half-listened until the audit landed. My sister had been promoting this version of me for years, emotional, imprecise, eager for inclusion. The family repeated it until it hardened into policy. At donor events, I stood at the edge of photos and was cropped for distribution to fit layout constraints. At board dinners, Vivian introduced me as the sensitive one, then accepted sympathetic smiles on my behalf. When a foundation grant review praised my risk memorandum, she called my contribution clerical support and moved to the next item. The script did not require shouting, it required repetition. 3 years earlier, at a compliance retreat in Boston, I watched Vivian tell a retired examiner that I helped with binders while my reconciliation framework sat on the screen behind her under the bank's crest. She said it lightly, and the room laughed politely, and I learned something permanent that day. Public minimization is most durable when delivered as charm. The record says one thing, the room remembers another. Any objection to witness reliability notation? Martin asked dutifully. No one spoke. He looked at me then, a formal courtesy shaped like an exit ramp. Ms. Robinson. My name in that voice always carried distance. I kept my hands folded and answered with the same tone he used. No objection to notation. Vivian's shoulders settled a fraction, almost imperceptibly, the way a fencer relaxes after confirming distance. Then she advanced. Given that concern, I move to suspend Haley's voting authority on trust amendments pending independent review. We cannot risk procedural contamination. Procedural contamination, another clean phrase. Another way to say remove her now, justify it later. It. The fiduciary consultant asked, duration? Until we complete ledger validation, Vivian replied. 72 hours should be sufficient. 72 hours was enough to execute the transfer sequence she wanted under emergency administration language. Once assets moved into the shell of temporary management, reversal would become an expensive legal labyrinth. Not unfixable, just costly, slow, and publicly exhausting. She knew I knew that. She did not have to look at me to communicate it. I felt the old split open inside me then, the one I had carried since childhood dinners where my father asked Vivian about strategy and asked me to pass the salt. Not because he hated me, but because he had a taxonomy for usefulness, and I had been filed under ornamental. Vivian inherited the taxonomy intact and refined it with modern tools. Governance vocabulary, compliance postures, concern for optics. She did not need to call me weak. She needed only to describe me as regrettably unreliable. Silence wasn't peace. It was surrender. I had repeated that sentence to myself for months, but that afternoon I understood its counterpart with equal force. Noise was not always resistance. Sometimes noise was the trap. I lifted my pen and wrote one line in the margin of my packet where no camera could read it. Wait for the record that cannot be staged. Martin called for discussion. Voices followed in careful increments, each speaker protecting institutional skin. Uncle Grant proposed temporary de-escalation. One observer asked whether an abstention category might preserve family harmony. The phrase drifted across polished wood and settled nowhere. My mother finally spoke softly, without looking up. Perhaps we should avoid making this personal. Personal. as if the accusation had not just been welded to my name on an official transcript. I looked at the clock again. 2:19 p.m. In my peripheral vision, the city moved behind glass, indifferent and exact. Elevators rose and fell. Traffic lines shifted. Sunlight caught on neighbouring towers and bounced into the room in narrow bars that crossed the table, crossed Vivian's tablet, crossed my folded hands. I thought about the cost ledger of my own life, not financial, but relational. Every time I stayed late to repair risk controls I was not credited for, every holiday meal where my competence became a punchline wrapped in concern, every meeting where neutrality protected the speaker with power and disciplined the one without it. When Martin asked if I wished to make a statement before the motion advanced, the room turned in one synchronized motion that would have looked, on camera, like procedural courtesy. I met his eyes and gave him exactly one sentence. I request that any vote taken today be contingent on a full records integrity review by independent digital forensics, with time-stamped source logs preserved under institutional retention protocol. It was narrow by design, almost dry. No accusation, no theatre. Just a doorway that required evidence to pass through. Vivian exhaled through her nose, the smallest sound of irritation crossing the microphones. "There is no basis for that request," she said. "This is delay behaviour." Martin asked, "Do you have supporting grounds, Ms. Robinson?" I kept my gaze level. "I will submit grounds through counsel before close of business." He nodded once and noted it for the record. The motion to suspend my vote remained pending. The room proceeded to the next agenda line, as if nothing essential had happened, as if the sentence that tried to erase me had not just been memorialized in company archives. But I had marked the time. I had marked the packet revision. I had marked the altered row and the cadence breaks and the places where language outpaced fact. They believed my stillness was capitulation because they had mistaken restraint for vacancy my entire life. It was discipline. It was always discipline. And for the first time in that room, I no longer needed them to confuse me in order to control me. Vivian clicked her stylus against the edge of her tablet. Once, then again, a metronome for everyone else's compliance. "Then let us memorialize scope," she said. "Haley's request is noted but unsupported. Pending that submission, I renew the motion to suspend her vote immediately and to limit her access to draft transfer schedules to read-only summaries." She turned slightly toward Martin as if I were an administrative concern rather than a person at the table. "I also request that this be entered as a risk control step, not a punitive one." The recorder light stayed red. The microphones caught everything, including the low whir of the climate system pushing cold air over my side of the table. It caught my mother's bracelet, touching the packet rings. It caught Uncle Grant, shifting his chair legs on the waxed floor. It caught, most of all, the practiced cadence of a woman who knew perception could be manufactured faster than facts could be verified. Through the glass wall, two private client associates paused at the corridor intersection, saw the occupied conference room and moved on with their voices lowered. Inside, the performance proceeded in a room built to look transparent, while concealing where power actually sat. Martin looked to me again. "Ms. Robinson, do you object to access limitations while your request is reviewed?" I heard the trap as clearly as if it had been printed in bold. If I objected, I became obstructive. If I consented, I helped build the procedural architecture designed to sideline me. The crux had never been whether I could win an argument in that room. The crux was whether I could force the room to wait for records that did not care about family rank. I placed my pen parallel to the packet margin and answered in the same register they preferred. "I object to asymmetry," I said. "If my access is limited, then all discretionary transfer actions should be stayed until the same review is complete." Vivian gave a brief smile that never reached her eyes. "That is not operationally realistic. It is governance neutral. It is delay." There it was again, that single word she used as if speed itself were virtue. She did not mention that speed favoured the person already holding execution authority. She did not need to. The board observers wrote anyway, heads down, documenting a procedural exchange without ever naming the underlying geometry. One sibling with system keys, one sibling without them, and a room willing to call that balance. By 2:27 p.m., the sunlight had shifted across the table, the bright bars now cutting through the stack of signature tabs in front of the fiduciary consultant. He cleared his throat and tried to sound disinterested. Could the parties accept a 96-hour standstill? Vivian answered first. No, Treasury sequencing is already coordinated. I spoke after a measured breath. Then we are discussing irreversible movement before verification. The consultant looked at Martin, not at me. Counsel? Martin folded his hands. From a legal standpoint, we can proceed with reservations noted. From a governance standpoint, caution is advisable. It was the most he would risk in open session. Caution is advisable meant I see the edge, and I will not be the one to name it. My mother finally lifted her gaze, and for one moment I thought she might interrupt the choreography, might say my father had asked me to review every trust amendment for 10 years, precisely because I could read the line items no one else noticed. Instead, she said, "Can we keep this civil?" The sentence landed like a linen cloth laid over broken glass. It looked tidy. It solved nothing. Vivian pivoted to the monitor and cast a slide deck none of us had been given in advance. The header read Communication Integrity Timeline. Under it, 3 cropped screenshots of my emails appeared, each one stripped of thread context and date range. My request for raw ledger extracts from the previous month. My note questioning an unexplained sequence gap. My statement that version control appears inconsistent with source chronology. On the slide, each excerpt sat beside a red annotation, speculative, inflammatory, unsupported. Since reliability has been raised, Vivian said, I believe the group deserves pattern visibility. That sentence cut cleaner than the earlier accusation because it wore the costume of transparency. I felt heat rise along my neck despite the cold vent, felt my pulse sharpen in my wrists where my hands remained still. She had taken my own cautionary emails and reframed them as instability. In another context, it would have been a crude trick. In a family governance room with counsel and observers and formal minutes, it became a reputational instrument. Uncle Grant attempted concern. Haley, perhaps you should have raised these privately. I kept my voice level. I did. Vivian did not look at him. The point is pattern. When she feels excluded, she alleges manipulation. No one corrected her. No one asked why excluded had become her preferred word for any process from which she had already removed me. The humiliation was not loud. It was methodical, administered in front of witnesses who would later describe themselves as neutral. I watched one board observer glance toward the camera angle, then toward my seat beyond its frame, and I understood he had just noticed what had been arranged before I arrived. He looked down again, wrote nothing about it, and became part of the architecture by choosing omission. Martin asked, "Do you wish to respond to the characterization, Ms. Robinson?" I could have dismantled every screenshot in under 5 minutes. I could have read the missing timestamps aloud, identified the omitted attachments, and shown that each email had been sent after specific discrepancies appeared in the audit trail. I could have done it fast. And if I had, Vivian would have called it emotional overcorrection. The room would have remembered tone, not substance. I looked at the red annotations on the screen, then at the recorder light, then at the clock. I wish to respond in writing with complete thread metadata, I said. Vivian laughed once, soft and controlled. Of course. That single syllable sheared through me more than shouting would have. It told the room my restraint was theatre, that my demand for evidence was affectation, that I was performing seriousness because I had no facts. I let the sound pass without reaction and returned my attention to the packet. Row 17 remained wrong. A posthumous transfer instruction had been resequenced to appear contiguous with pre-existing authorizations. If you did not live inside timestamp logic, it looked routine. If you did, it looked like someone had manually moved a hinge and expected no one to notice the door now sat unevenly in its frame. Proceed to vote, Vivian said. Martin nodded. Motion on the floor, temporary suspension of Miss Robinson's voting authority pending review, with limited document access as outlined. The fiduciary consultant raised his hand first. Conditional yes. Uncle Grant followed, yes. One board observer abstained, the other deferred to counsel. My mother hesitated long enough for the pause to acquire shape, then said, I abstain. Martin recorded the result, then looked to me for formal acknowledgement. Noted, I said. No tremor, no raised volume, no gift to the narrative being written about me in real time. Vivian moved immediately to the next line item. Given the vote, I request accelerated execution authority for temporary transfer controls before close of banking day. That was the real motion. Everything before it had been staging. Martin asked whether there were objections, and I answered before anyone else could fill the silence. Yes, I said. Objection based on unresolved records integrity variance and pending submission. Vivian's jaw tightened barely. You cannot hold operations hostage with insinuations. I am invoking protocol. You are manufacturing uncertainty. Martin lifted a hand, finally exerting process. Enough. Ms. Robinson, you stated you would submit supporting grounds by close of business. Confirm. Confirmed. Then this chair will defer accelerated execution authority until council receives that submission. Vivian turned to him, incredulous but still composed. On what basis? On litigation risk, Martin said, and for the first time that afternoon his voice held steel. If she files and we move anyway, this room becomes discoverable in ways none of us prefer. The room went still, not because justice had appeared, but because liability had. In our family system, moral language rarely moved decisions. Exposure did. Vivian leaned back and closed the slide deck with a firm tap. Her face remained controlled, yet the rhythm she had maintained all afternoon fractured for one beat too long. She recovered quickly, asked to move to adjournment logistics, and began assigning post-meeting tasks with clipped efficiency. When the recorder finally went dark at 2:54 p.m., chairs shifted and conversations broke into low, careful fragments. The board observers exited first, thanking no one in particular. Uncle Grant touched my shoulder as he passed and said, "Don't escalate this, Haley," as if escalation had been invented by the person requesting verification rather than the person pressing execution before verification. My mother gathered her papers with precise hands and stopped beside me without meeting my eyes. "Your father would have hated this spectacle," she said. I looked at the portrait by the door, the one moved into place for symbolic gravity. "He built the room where spectacle could replace truth," I answered quietly. She flinched as if I had spoken too plainly, then walked out. I stayed seated until the corridor noise thinned. Vivian remained at the head of the table, reviewing her tablet, pretending not to notice that I had not moved. At last she said, "If you file something reckless, you will damage all of us." The cedar citrus scent was fainter now, mixed with stale coffee and the metallic chill of conditioned air. I rose, gathered my packet, and faced her across the polished wood that had carried our family's rehearsed hierarchies for years. "I am filing something accurate," I said. She stood then, one hand on the back of her chair. "You are out of your depth." I held her gaze without heat. "No, I am in my discipline." For the first time all day, she looked directly unsettled, not by volume, not by threat, but by the absence of both. She had prepared for protest, for tears, for anger she could categorize and dismiss. She had not prepared for a narrower weapon, precise procedure, timed correctly, with nowhere for theatre to hide. I stepped away from the table, passed beneath our father's painted eyes, and entered the corridor where the glass walls reflected me at full height, instead of a cropped shoulder beyond camera frame. At the elevator alcove, I opened my briefcase, removed the sealed compliance request file I had carried in from the start, and set it against the ledge long enough to check its contents one more time. Draft motion language, records integrity statute citations, chain of custody request form, and the engraved hardware token linked to immutable audit retrieval, heavy in my palm like a small, cold promise. Then I called external counsel from the private line outside the conference room and said, "Submit now. Preserve everything." "Received," Daniel Cho said on the other end. His voice clipped into legal tempo the moment he heard mine. "I am filing a preservation notice and emergency motion shell now. I need your sworn declaration in 45 minutes. I can give you 30. Then give me 25 and keep it narrow. Facts, timestamps, no adjectives." The elevator doors opened with a muted chime. I stepped inside, pressed lobby, and watched my reflection fragment across brushed steel. My face looked composed in a way that would have reassured anyone who did not know the cost of that composure. At the 10th floor, A senior private banker entered, saw me, and offered the sympathetic half-smile reserved for family members who were expected to remain ornamental. He didn't ask if the summit had gone well. He asked, "Long afternoon?" with the same tone people used when they meant, "I heard there was a scene." I nodded once and said nothing. Silence had been assigned to me for so long that everyone thought it belonged to them. By 3:11 p.m, I was in the legal workroom 2 blocks from the bank, the one with low fluorescent light, metal shelving, and a conference table scarred by years of binders dragged across its surface. Daniel had already opened a draft caption in District Probate Court and left a blank line where my declaration would be attached. He slid a legal pad toward me and set a digital recorder between us. "Start with relationship and role," he said. Then history of exclusion only as it affects records access. Then discrepancy specifics. Only as it affects records access. That was the discipline. Not grief, not family mythology, not the private humiliations that had accumulated like sediment over decades. Yet the legal line between relevant and irrelevant is thinner than people think. Access did not begin in software permissions. It began much earlier, with who was believed, who was credited, and who was framed as decorative when she spoke. "I am Hayley Robinson," I said into the recorder, each word measured. "Beneficiary under the Robinson Estate Instruments. Former head of Forensic Risk Architecture for Robinson Continental Treasury Controls. Current trust voter whose authority was suspended today, pending alleged reliability concerns." Daniel watched my face, not from concern but from practice, tracking whether I was about to widen the frame. "Go on." I did, and as I did, the years I had trained myself to narrate without tremor began to line up in procedural order. I described the donor gala in my first year on the Foundation Advisory Committee, where Vivian introduced me to board guests as our compassionate sister, excellent with people, then handed speaking time to a consultant presenting my fraud loss model without attribution. I described the quarterly credit risk meeting when I flagged a mismatch between settlement date and authorization chain, and Vivian responded in front of 30 staff and 2 regulators. Hayley sees patterns where there are feelings, converting analytic caution into personality defect before anyone could open the logs. I described the photograph rituals, the seating maps, the way my name appeared in appendices but not executive summaries, the way my work surfaced under collective nouns while Vivian's work carried singular credit. Daniel interrupted once. "Did anyone correct those statements in real time?" "No." "Did you?" "Not in the room." "Why not?" "Because correction had always been turned into evidence against me. Because in our family institutions, tone outranked fact unless fact arrived with external certification. Because the first time I raised my voice 8 years earlier in a strategy retreat where Vivian called a critical control exception clerical noise, my father had looked at me across a polished table and said, "Compose yourself, Hayley. This is not a performance space." 20 minutes later, when Vivian dismissed my concern again in a softer voice, he called her decisive. I learned the taxonomy that day in permanent ink. I answered Daniel with the legal version. Prior objections were reframed as emotional volatility and used to restrict my access. He nodded and wrote, then asked for concrete instances tied to records. I gave him 3. The first was from 6 years earlier, when I built a timestamp reconciliation layer for international treasury transfers after a near-miss internal incident. The tool cross-checked user authentication events against ledger commits and message bus propagation times. It was not glamorous and it prevented quiet disasters. At rollout, Vivian told senior leadership I had supported implementation logistics. She said it standing beside a slide with my architecture map still carrying my internal initials in the lower right corner. Nobody asked what logistics meant in a system that cut false positives by 41% in 1 quarter. The second was from Boston. The compliance retreat I still remembered by smell. Hotel carpet cleaner, stale coffee, winter coats drying by heat vents. A retired examiner asked who designed the anomaly threshold protocol now being adopted across divisions. Vivian smiled and said, "Hayley helped with binders." Laughter, polite and brief. I sat through the rest of the panel while she accepted follow-up meetings based on work she had not written. That was the moment I stopped asking for family acknowledgement and started keeping external corroboration. The third was after our father's stroke, when estate draft language began moving through private channels. I requested source logs for transfer rule edits and was denied full extraction under role optimization. Vivian granted me view-only snapshots and called it transparency. I wrote concerns anyway, in formal language with references. Those concerns were later presented today as proof that I fabricate numbers under stress. Daniel tapped his pen. Good. Now connect to today's packet. I read directly from my notes. Revision C timestamp 1342. Row 17 chronology mismatch against prior read-only metadata. Requested independent records integrity review before execution. Vote suspension motion advanced. Accelerated transfer authority requested prior to verification. Counsel deferred execution only due to litigation risk after I confirmed same-day filing. Facts in sequence, no heat. When I finished, Daniel stopped the recorder and leaned back. This is strong if we keep it narrow. The court does not care about who got cropped out of family photos. I know. It may care that exclusion practices were used to control data visibility. That is the only reason I mentioned them. He studied me for a long second, then gave a short nod. Then we file. He turned to his associate and dictated with the precision of someone threading a needle while the room shook. Emergency motion to compel independent timestamp release under Records Integrity Statute. Request for temporary stay on discretionary estate transfers pending forensics. Request for order preserving raw logs, token authentication trails, and chain of custody artifacts. No allegations of motive, only chronology conflict and risk of irreversible movement. The language was dry enough to survive scrutiny, and that dryness steadied me more than comfort would have. At 3:46 p.m., while the associate formatted exhibits, Daniel pushed a witness statement template toward me. We need one more element, he said. Physical evidence item tied to immutable retrieval. You told me in the hallway you have a hardware token. I opened my briefcase and placed it on the table between us. It was smaller than most people expected. Matte steel with a narrow seam and a recessed contact strip. Heavy for its size, built for durability rather than aesthetics. Along one edge, an engraving read RCB-FR/IR-07, and beneath it, in finer lettering, Custody Acknowledged, H. Robinson. The token did not contain the ledger itself. It contained access credentials bound to an archival retrieval pathway that could pull signed audit extracts from retention storage without permitting alteration. In plain language, it was a key that opened a vault no one could redecorate after entering. Daniel put on nitrile gloves before touching it. He was careful that way, the kind of careful people call paranoid until they need him. Walk me through provenance. Issued to me when I led forensic risk architecture, dual control retrieval design after the North Corridor incident review. Token retired from active operations when my role was reduced, but archival retrieval authority remained valid for legacy systems under compliance exception. Who approved exception? Elaine Park, Regional Director of Digital Forensics. His eyes lifted. Will she authenticate? If subpoenaed, yes. Voluntarily, uncertain. Why uncertain? Because this is the Robinson account cluster. He understood. Institutional integrity has many advocates in theory and fewer in rooms where surnames can move careers. He set the token down on clean paper, photographed all sides, and labeled the image for exhibit index. Then he looked at the engraving again. This is your symbolic hinge, he said, almost to himself. Not sentiment. Authority! The words landed harder than he intended. Symbolic hinge. For years, every object linked to my work had been translated into someone else's narrative. My risk memos as support notes, my flagged discrepancies as overreaction, my quiet as incapacity. The token sat under fluorescent light and refused translation. It was procedural, traceable, indifferent to family myth. The metal held the room's cold and gave nothing back. At 4:02 p.m., Daniel called the court clerk to request emergency calendar placement. Speakerphone filled the workroom with the bright, fatigued voice of someone managing other people's crises by rulebook. Probate emergency docket is constrained, the clerk said. Basis? Potential posthumous transfer chronology conflict, risk of irreversible asset movement, and pending records integrity request tied to institutional retention logs. A pause, keyboard clicks, file before 4:30 with supporting declaration and statute citations. If accepted, hearing tomorrow morning, subject to judge availability. Accepted by whom? Duty judge review at intake. No informal hold, not without filed motion. Daniel thanked her and disconnected. External contact logged. Outcome clear. File now or lose the window. No one in that chain cared about Robinson family status. They cared about timestamps, docket pressure, and whether we had done our paperwork correctly. The neutrality was blunt, and for once, it felt clean in the right way. I signed my declaration at 4:18 p.m. under penalty language that made every sentence feel like steel cable. Daniel signed council certification. The associate uploaded, received electronic confirmation, and printed the filing receipt before the ink in my signature line had mentally dried. Case number assigned. Hearing pending. Temporary uncertainty imposed on a machine that had expected to move unopposed. Only then did my phone light with Vivian's name. Daniel glanced at me. Do not answer. I let it ring out, then watched a message arrive. If you continue this, you will trigger mandatory governance sanctions. Withdraw by 5. No greeting, no sister, only command and threat, wrapped in compliance vocabulary. I handed the phone to Daniel and he photographed the screen for potential exhibit, then returned it without comment. We both knew what it was. Pressure before proof. At 4:27 p.m, another message followed, this one from Martin. Please confirm whether your filing seeks a temporary stay only or broader injunctive relief. He was trying to map risk. I dictated a reply Daniel approved. Temporary stay limited to discretionary transfer execution pending independent timestamp verification and chain of custody confirmation. Nothing broader at this stage. The outcome appeared 3 minutes later when Martin responded, Understood. I will advise against execution until hearing disposition. That line mattered. It did not make him courageous. It made him useful. The workroom had gone quiet except for printer hum and hallway footsteps. Outside, evening light was flattening into a grey metallic band along the windows of neighbouring buildings. I placed the hardware token back into its evidence sleeve, sealed it, signed across the tape, and dated it. Daniel countersigned as receiving counsel. Physical evidence collected and stored with chain notation complete. No theatrics, no vows. Just a sealed seam and 2 signatures. For the first time since the recorder light turned red in the summit room, my breathing settled into an even rhythm. Years of invalidation had taught me to survive being misnamed. Years of technical work had taught me that systems eventually reveal who touched them and when, if you preserve the pathway before someone with access rewrites the story. The 2 lessons had lived separately inside me for too long, one emotional and one procedural. That afternoon, in a fluorescent workroom with a scarred table and a steel token between legal pads, they finally locked together. At 4:41 p.m, 10, the court portal updated. Emergency hearing set for 9 a.m. District probate. Evidentiary scope limited to records integrity and interim governance control. Daniel printed the notice and slid it across to me. Tomorrow they will try to frame you as a disgruntled relative, he said. Do not fight that frame with biography. Fight it with chronology. I folded the notice once and placed it beside the sealed token. Chronology is all I brought. When I stepped back into the corridor, the building's air smelled of rain coming in off the river, and the city had that hammered steel dusk that made every window look like a closed file. I stood under the awning for one measured breath before moving toward the car service line. Phone silent in my hand, evidence secured, hearing set, and for the first time in years the next room would not belong solely to whoever spoke first. A car pulled up under the awning before I lifted my hand, black paint carrying a faint sheen from the first mist off the river, and when I gave the driver my name he checked his tablet twice and said, with professional politeness that still managed to bruise, I'm assigned to Ms. Vivian Robinson's party list only. He did not apologise. He did not have to. In my family, exclusion rarely arrived as refusal. It arrived as list management. I stepped back from the curb, rain beginning to stipple the concrete, and opened my own ride app while the car idled 2 feet away. Through the rear window I could see a folded garment bag and a leather folio with the Robinson crest stamped in gold. The driver caught my eye once in the mirror, then looked forward until Vivian's chief of staff emerged from the revolving door and slid into the back seat without acknowledging me. The car moved off in silence. I stood under the awning with my briefcase, my sealed evidence sleeve, and the old familiar awareness that my surname opened doors for everyone in my line, except me. Daniel called before my ride arrived. I need one procedural decision tonight, he said. If they offer a private standstill in exchange for withdrawing the motion, do we accept? No. Even if it preserves assets temporarily? A private standstill vanishes when the room changes. I want court language. He exhaled once, a sound of agreement and calculation at the same time. Then expect pressure. They'll frame you as destabilizing governance. They already did. That narrative will be sharper by morning. By the time I reached my apartment, the rain had turned steady and fine, the kind that blurred traffic lights into red and amber streaks across wet pavement. I dropped my bag on the entry bench, set the token sleeve in the locked drawer, and opened my laptop to find 17 new emails in the family governance distribution list. Vivian had moved quickly. She had circulated a risk advisory memo at 5:02 p.m. to trustees, foundation observers, and 2 outside directors who had not attended the summit. The subject line read, Interim Stability Measures. My name appeared 9 times in 3 pages, always beside terms like escalation exposure, reputational drag, and procedural unpredictability. She never called me dishonest in that memo. She called me destabilizing, which in our circles was often worse. At 6:14 p.m, a second message arrived from the governance office, not from Vivian directly, but from the committee administrator who had watched me get seated outside the camera frame that afternoon. Effective immediately, my access to the internal board portal had been reduced to Archive View Pending Review. The link to tomorrow's pre-hearing coordination packet returned an error. No explanation beyond policy language. No mention that I was a trust voter whose authority had not yet been lawfully removed. A smaller slight than the one at the table, but cleaner, harder to contest in casual conversation, and therefore more durable. I forwarded both emails to Daniel with one line. Record this sequence. He called back in under a minute. Good. External pressure timed to filing acknowledgement. We can use this to oppose sanctions rhetoric. I also just lost live portal access. Screenshot the access error with timestamp and URL. Then stop touching the portal. I did. Then sent him the captures and closed the laptop. The apartment hummed with refrigerator noise and rain tapping the balcony rail. I made tea I did not drink. I changed into a grey suit, pressed cuffs, low heels, no jewellery except my father's steel watch, the only object he had ever given me that felt like utility instead of apology. At 8:03 p.m, another email came in, this one from Martin, copied to both councils. Opposing party intends to seek fees for bad faith delay if no bank production appears by hearing. He was warning me and documenting himself simultaneously. I replied through Daniel's address only, attaching nothing new, confirming again that our request was narrow and evidence-based. 3 days earlier, they had called me reactive for asking to preserve logs. By that night, they were threatening fee sanctions for waiting on the same logs. The contradiction did not bother them because contradiction had never been the weakness in their method. Audience control was the method. If enough people heard uncertainty in my voice, certainty in their procedures became optional. I slept in 90-minute increments and woke before dawn to the city washed clean and metallic. By 7:20 a.m, District Probate's lower corridor smelled of wet wool and copier heat. The security line moved in clipped bursts, bins sliding, belts unthreaded, phones surrendered and reclaimed. Daniel met me at the second checkpoint with 2 associates and a wheeled case of exhibits. He handed me a paper cup of coffee and a folder tabbed in blue. Opposition filed at 6:41, he said as we walked. They're calling this a family grievance dressed up as technical panic. They want immediate execution authority and fees. Who signed? Lead associate from Farrow Pike. Vivian stayed off signature line. We turned into Hearing Room C's anteroom, where ceiling fluorescence flattened everyone's skin tone into the same courtroom pallor. Vivian stood at the far end with her counsel, charcoal again, hair fixed, posture exact. She glanced at me once, then resumed speaking as if I were staff passing behind her. One of Farrow Pike's associates, a man young enough to still mistake confidence for volume, looked directly at me and asked Daniel, "Is your client prepared to limit testimony to personal observations? We'd prefer not to spend the court's morning on speculative systems theory." He said it in front of me, not to me. Daniel answered without turning his head. "Our client built the reconciliation architecture your side is trying to characterize from a brochure." The associate gave a practiced smile. "Noted. A junior clerk appeared with a seating chart and looked first to Vivian's side. Counsel and principals only at front tables. Additional family may use gallery. Additional family. That was the label the morning offered me, even with my declaration on file and my name in the motion caption. Daniel handed her our appearance sheet. She scanned it, frowned, and said, "Ms. Robinson is listed as movant, yes, but if she is represented, she can remain in gallery unless called." I answered before Daniel could, keeping my tone at clerk-level formality. "I will sit where movants sit. I'm also a fact witness." The clerk hesitated, then marked her sheet and said, "One seat behind counsel, then," as if she were extending a favour. She moved on before I could respond. The slight was procedural, small enough to sound petty if repeated, and that was why it worked. By the first week of November, I had learned to log those moments as data rather than injury, where they placed you, what they called you, who corrected it, and who left it standing. At 8:56 a.m, we entered. The room held old wood, pale stone, and the dry scent of paper handled too many times. Judge Eleanor Baines took the bench at 9 on the minute, read the caption, and set terms with efficient severity. "I am not retrying family history," she said. "I am addressing whether interim governance controls should shift before records integrity is tested." Vivian's counsel argued first, smooth and clipped. He called me a disappointed beneficiary, repackaging interpersonal conflict as technical emergency. He said delay would harm routine operations. He said there was no competent evidence of manipulation, only insinuation from an interested sibling previously flagged for reliability issues by governance leadership. The phrasing was nearly elegant. I recognized 3 lines lifted from Vivian's evening memo. Daniel rose and answered with chronology only. Filing time. Packet revision time. Requested stay scope. Risk of irreversible movement. Existing preservation duty once notice issued. He did not look at Vivian while he spoke, which irritated her more than accusation would have. He asked for one narrow order. No discretionary transfers until independent timestamp logs were produced and authenticated. Then Judge Baines looked at me. "Ms. Robinson, you submitted declaration testimony. I will hear from you briefly. No speeches." I stood. The microphone carried every breath too loudly. "Your Honour, my request is limited. Yesterday's packet included a transfer sequence that conflicts with prior metadata viewed under read-only access. I requested independent verification before execution. My voting authority was suspended, and accelerated transfer authority was sought before verification completed. I am asking the court to keep chronology ahead of control." Vivian's counsel rose. "Move to strike that final phrase as argumentative." "Denied," Judge Baines said. "Sit down." Cross-examination came quickly. Farrow Pike's associate took it, eager, voice bright with institutional impatience. He asked whether I held an active bank operations role. I said no. He asked whether family disagreements existed long before this filing. I said yes. He asked if I had ever accused Vivian of misconduct in writing. I said I had raised records concerns in writing. Yes. He emphasized family strain, old conflicts, advisory role changes, my lack of current system credentials, each point arranged to make me look like an outsider with technical nostalgia. When he asked, "Isn't it true you're not currently authorized to access live transaction infrastructure?" I answered, "It is true. I requested independent access for that reason." He blinked, then moved on faster. At 9:32 a.m., he reached for the sanctions request. "Would you agree your motion has already disrupted normal governance and imposed costs? I would agree that verification takes time. Would you agree those costs are your responsibility if no manipulation is proven? I would agree costs are part of lawful review." He smiled toward the bench. No further questions. The smile faded when Judge Baines asked the question that mattered. "Has the bank produced an independent witness on timestamp integrity?" Vivian's lead counsel stood. "Not at this time, Your Honour. We believe internal affidavits should suffice if the court requires supplementation. Internal affidavits from parties under dispute do not suffice," the judge said. "I asked for independent bank forensics presence when this was calendared." He began, "We were informed the relevant director was unavailable." The courtroom door opened behind him with a soft hydraulic sigh, and every head turned with the reflex of people trained to track authority by movement. A woman in a navy suit stepped in, carrying 2 sealed document boxes and a slim black case. Mid-50s, silver at the temples, posture of someone accustomed to briefing rooms where minutes cost money. I knew her before the clerk announced her name. Elaine Park, the clerk said, reading from the late witness slip. Regional Director, Digital Forensics, Robinson Continental Bank. For one suspended beat, Vivian did not move at all. Then her hand closed around the table edge, not hard enough for spectacle, hard enough for anyone nearby to notice. Judge Baines looked over her glasses. Ms. Park, were you subpoenaed? Elaine set the boxes on the evidence cart with careful economy. I received a subpoena at 7:12 a.m., Your Honour, and I am appearing with certified extracts under institutional duty. Vivian's counsel stepped forward. Your Honour, we object to any testimony beyond scope absent pre-review. Judge Baines lifted a hand. You can object after foundation. Miss Park, do you have chain of custody documentation? I do. She opened the black case and removed a stapled packet with colour-coded seals, then glanced once across the room and let her eyes settle on me. Not with sentiment, not with rescue, but with professional recognition so clean it felt like oxygen. For clarity, she said to the bench, the movant, Ms. Hayley Robinson, led the original reconciliation framework this retention protocol is built on. I can authenticate that from personnel and implementation records. No one in that room applauded. No one needed to. The air did not warm. The fluorescent lights did not soften. The old wood remained old wood. But the social geometry shifted in a single, verifiable movement, from who had spoken first to who could prove sequence. Vivian's associate looked down at his notes as if he had misplaced a page that could restore the morning. The junior clerk who had called me additional family stopped writing for a moment, then resumed with tighter strokes. Judge Baines nodded once. Very well. We will proceed with foundation testimony. I sat down slowly behind Daniel, hands flat on the table, pulse steadying under my father's watch, and for the first time since the summit recorder light turned red, the room was no longer asking whether I sounded credible. It was preparing to hear timestamps. Elaine raised her right hand, took the oath without flourish, and settled into the witness chair as if she had done this 100 times, and regretted every one. The courtroom quieted into that particular legal stillness where paper stops moving and even the ventilation feels cautious. Daniel stood, approached the lectern, and began foundation with his usual economy. Please state your full name and current role for the record. Elaine Min Park, Regional Director of Digital Forensics, Robinson Continental Bank. How long have you held that role? 9 years. Do your duties include retention protocol oversight, incident response extractions, and audit log certification? They do. He held up the first sealed packet. Did you bring certified extracts responsive to subpoena in this matter? I did. 2 sets, one from immutable retention archives and one from operational mirrors for cross-validation. Vivian's lead counsel rose before Daniel could continue. Objection, Your Honour, to characterization as immutable without technical foundation. Judge Baines did not look up from the exhibit list. Foundation is being laid. Sit. Counsel sat. Vivian did not move. Daniel turned one page. Ms. Park, describe the extraction pathway you used. Elaine's voice stayed level, almost clinical. At 7:41 a.m., under subpoena control, I initiated archival retrieval through our forensic gateway. Retrieval requires dual authorization and produces a cryptographic digest at extraction and at export. Any modification between those points invalidates verification. Both digests matched. Did you personally supervise that process? Yes. Did anyone from the Robinson family governance group, including Vivian Robinson, participate in or influence the extraction? No. The associate from Farrow Pike rose again, trying for momentum. Objection to non-responsive breadth. Overruled, Judge Baines said. You may cross later. Daniel nodded once and moved to the hinge. Ms. Park, did you review transaction history edits linked to the estate transfer schedule now under dispute? I did. What did you find? Elaine opened a tabbed section, slid on reading glasses, and read directly. 3 posthumous edits to transaction sequencing metadata, affecting the line item identified in internal packaging as row 17. Edit events occurred at 21:14:08, 21:17:53, and 21:22:11, all on the same date, all initiated under credential family tied to Executive Token Class Vol Robinson 01. The room did not gasp. Courtrooms rarely do, but the silence changed texture from procedural patience to impact. Daniel asked, "Were those edits part of ordinary automated system propagation?" No, they were manual interventions through privileged pathway. He let that sentence sit before he asked the next. "Did you review prior sworn statements regarding access at those times?" "I reviewed declarations provided by counsel this morning." "Do the declarations align with your logs?" "No." She lifted her eyes toward the bench. "The declarations state Miss Vivian Robinson was not in system during the period in question. Log evidence shows authenticated privileged activity from credential scope assigned to her executive token." Vivian's counsel stood so quickly his chair clipped the table leg. "Objection. Identity attribution is speculative without biometric confirmation." Elaine answered before anyone else could. "Our protocol does not rely on biometric confirmation for this control family. It relies on token auth pairing, session certificate, and command signature continuity. All 3 align." Judge Baines looked to counsel. "You may challenge reliability on cross. Objection. Overruled." By 9:47 a.m., the hearing had crossed the point where narrative could outrun chronology. I felt it physically. A release not of emotion but of compression, like pressure equalizing in a sealed room. The junior clerk who had called me additional family now wrote without looking up, line after line, no pauses for social reading. Across the aisle, an attendee in the back row sat rigid in the gallery, pen untouched, finally learning what the camera never had to show in order to matter. Daniel placed the second exhibit packet on the evidence card. "Ms. Park, I'm showing you what has been marked Movance Exhibit 12. Do you recognize it?" "I do. That is the certified chain of custody report for the extraction set." "Is it complete?" "Yes." He lifted a smaller evidence sleeve. "And Movance Exhibit 13? Elaine leaned forward slightly. "Hardware token RCB-FR/IR-07. Custody acknowledged to Haley Robinson under Legacy Forensic Exception. I authorized that exception during control transition restructuring." "Does that token alter logs?" "No, it authorizes retrieval access to archived signed logs. It is read pathway, not write pathway." "Is that distinction significant here?" "It is central here." The associate for Vivian took cross with a bright, brittle confidence that weakened with each answer. He suggested token compromise. Elaine said no anomaly signatures, no failed auth cascades, no chain breaks. He suggested archival corruption. She said digest parity across archive and mirror, statistically incompatible with casual corruption. He suggested lawful administrative cleanup mislabeled as manual edits. She said cleanup scripts leave automation markers. These entries did not. He suggested role confusion around credential family. She asked to read the credential assignment report into record. He declined. Judge Baines invited her to read it anyway. She did. Credential family Fee Robinson 01. Executive privileges attached to Vivian Robinson Governance Authority. Effective date unchanged through event period. The associate sat down with visible reluctance, shuffled his notes, then stood again for one last attempt. "Ms. Park, can you state with absolute certainty who touched the keyboard?" "No," Elaine said. "I can state with certainty whose credential chain executed the commands. That is not the same thing. It is the operational standard your clients rely on every day." He stopped there. Daniel turned to the bench. "Your Honour, with permission, one limited question from Ms. Robinson as movant on technical scope." Judge Baines looked at me, then at the clock. "One question. Keep it narrow." I stood. The wood edge of counsel table pressed cool against my fingertips as I steadied my hand out of habit, not fear. I looked at Elaine, not at Vivian. "Ms. Park, Are these timestamps immutable under your institution's retention protocol, once extracted and certified as you described? Yes, Elaine said. They are. That was all. No speech, no accusation, just a question the room could not reinterpret. Judge Baines began ruling immediately, voice crisp enough to cut through the residual tension. On this record, the court finds competent evidence of chronology conflict and credible risk in discretionary transfers pending verification. The motion for immediate execution authority is denied. The request to suspend Ms. Haley Robinson's voting rights is vacated for interim governance purposes. Sanctions request for alleged bad faith delay is denied. A temporary stay is entered on discretionary estate transfers until full forensic production is completed. Certified extracts and corrected ledger sequence are entered into record today. She turned pages, then added, given discrepancies between sworn access representations and certified log evidence, the clerk will transmit this record to the appropriate fraud review channel. This is not a finding of liability. It is a referral. The reversal was brief and unmistakable, exactly as law prefers when facts are finally in the room. The same forum that had entertained language about my unreliability now restored my vote on the strength of verifiable sequence. No applause, no cinematic reaction, just ordered words entering a docket that would outlive everyone's tone. Vivian rose halfway through the ruling and tried to interrupt. Your Honour, this is disproportionate to an interim... Ms. Robinson, Judge Baines said, not raising her voice. You will sit down. Vivian did not sit immediately. For a fraction too long, she remained standing, one hand on the table edge, eyes fixed ahead, as if cadence alone could reassert hierarchy. Then she lowered herself into her chair with mechanical precision. Colour drained from her face in stages I would not have noticed years ago. First along the mouth, then under the eyes, then across her forehead where foundation could not conceal the sudden matte pallor. She asked her associate for a note, took the pen, and failed to write for several seconds because her hand had begun to tremble. Her lead counsel attempted damage control in procedural fragments. We request clarification on scope of referral. We reserve all rights regarding chain interpretation. We request expedited reconsideration window. Each sentence arrived thinner than the one before it. Judge Baines granted only what rules required and denied what optics requested. When counsel asked for immediate oral stay relief, she said, denied. File properly. He nodded, sat, and did not speak again. Across the aisle, a late arriving attendee had taken a gallery seat near the back wall. He stared at Vivian as if watching weather break over a house he assumed was stormproof. Another attendee, 2 rows ahead, kept adjusting the clasp of a handbag with repetitive, useless motions, eyes fixed on the witness stand instead of on either counsel table. A person near the end of the row reached for a phone, then stopped when the bailiff looked over. No one knew where to put their hands. Daniel passed me a yellow notepad with one line. Do not fill silence. I set it down unread for several seconds before I nodded. I had no desire to speak. Vindication in that room did not feel triumphant. It felt exact. The cost of being believed had simply shifted from performance to proof, and I was too tired to mistake that for joy. Vivian tried once more, this time not to the judge, but to the room itself, turning toward her counsel table mic, as if governance language could still command the audience. For the record, these are technical ambiguities, not misconduct, Elaine answered from the witness chair before Daniel could object, tone unchanged. They are not ambiguities. Vivian's mouth opened, then closed. The sentence she had prepared had nowhere to land. She looked down at the table, gripped the edge until her knuckles blanched, and stayed quiet. That silence was new. She had always relied on velocity, on speaking first and framing fast enough that everyone else argued on her map. With certified timestamps in evidence, speed could no longer outrun chronology. The architecture she built out of perception collapsed without noise. At 10:06 a.m., Judge Baines recessed for written order finalization. 15 minutes. People stood in uneven motions, papers gathered too quickly, chairs scraping the floor in short bursts. Vivian remained seated, staring at the stack of exhibits as though one page might still reopen the morning. Her associate leaned in to whisper. She nodded once without looking at him. When she finally rose, she reached for her water glass, misjudged the distance, and set it down again, untouched. I stayed where I was. Hands flat on the table, breathing measured. the steel weight of my father's watch against my wrist. Daniel began organising binders for the next phase, already thinking in deadlines and follow-up orders. Elaine closed her case, resealed her packets, and before stepping down gave me a single professional nod that carried no sentiment and no apology, only acknowledgement that sequence had held. In the gallery, the clerk called the next matter under her breath while waiting for the judge to return, and life in the courthouse moved forward with bureaucratic indifference. But at our table, the old language had broken. Liar. Sensitive. Destabilizing. Those words had been useful only while records stayed out of reach. With timestamps released into open court, they could not carry weight anymore. Vivian stood at last, turned as if to leave, then stopped when she realised there was nowhere to go that did not require passing the evidence cart. She paused beside it, eyes caught on Exhibit 12, and for the first time in my life she looked smaller than her voice. She did not look at me. She did not speak. She just moved past the cart in silence and took her place by counsel, waiting for an order she could not control. When court resumed, Judge Baines returned with the written order already marked in blue tabs, and the room rose in one uneven motion that sounded like fabric and wood rather than ceremony. She read the operative language into the microphone so there would be no argument later about what had been implied versus what had been entered. Discretionary estate transfers were stayed. My voting suspension was vacated effective immediately. The corrected ledger sequence from the bank's certified extract was entered as controlling for interim governance. The sanctions request against me was denied with prejudice at this stage. The fraud review referral was transmitted by the clerk before adjournment. Her voice never lifted, and that restraint gave the ruling more force than any theatrical rebuke could have. Vivian's counsel asked for clarification on one clause tied to interim control mechanics, and Judge Baines answered by reading from line 14. No party may unilaterally execute asset movement absent joint sign-off by both trust voters or further order of this court. Vivian looked straight ahead while the judge spoke, but her jaw had locked hard enough that the muscles near her ear jumped at each sentence. When the judge asked if either side sought additional relief, Daniel turned to me. I stood, felt the cool edge of the table against my palm, and gave the only request that mattered. I asked for independent co-trust governance and transparent reporting cadence while review proceeds. Monthly disclosure, source logs attached. Judge Baines nodded once. Granted, in principle, for interim period. Council will submit agreed reporting template by 5 p.m. today. If not agreed, I will impose one. That was the final transfer of control, not from one sister to another, but from personality to protocol. The gavel came down short and flat. Adjourned. No one spoke to me while we gathered our materials. The associate who had called my testimony speculative kept his eyes on his binder rings and avoided crossing my path. The junior clerk at the anteroom door held out 2 receipts without looking up, then glanced at the names and corrected her own cadence. Ms. Robinson. Signature for evidence disposition copies. It was procedural, not apologetic, and I signed anyway. Exhibit 12, chain of custody packet. Lodged with court, certified copy released to counsel. Exhibit 13, hardware token. Transferred under seal to bank forensics vault pending completion order. Receipt number stamped in red. Physical evidence accounted for. Nothing left floating in rumour. Elaine waited near the elevator bank with her black case closed and both document boxes now tagged for return transport. The corridor smelled of damp wool and printer toner. Courthouse weather. She did not waste language. You asked the right question in there, she said. You gave the answer that counted. Her expression shifted by half a degree as close as she came to warmth in professional spaces. For record completeness, my office sent preservation notices to internal security, compliance audit, and independent review by 10/22. No one can purge, overwrite, or relabel that sequence now without creating another trail. She handed Daniel a copy stamped received. External report outcome, documented in my hand before noon. And Haley, she added, your legacy exception file is being formally retired after this matter concludes. I recommend you receive written acknowledgement of your design authorship before closure. I will request it in writing today. Do that. She inclined her head and left for the service elevator, boxes rolling behind her like compact ordinary proof that had finally become visible. By 1:40 that afternoon, we were back in the same glass-walled conference room above the private client floor, and for the first time the seating map looked like governance instead of choreography. My brass nameplate sat on the centre line inside the recorder frame. Vivian's was still at the head, but now the camera captured both of us and the full table width. Martin had arranged the packets himself, I could tell by the square alignment and the absence of colour-coded editorial tabs from Vivian's office. The red recorder light came on, and he opened with a sentence I had waited years to hear spoken in that room. For the record, this session is convened under court order entered this morning, and prior reliability notation concerning Ms. Hayley Robinson is withdrawn pending forensic completion. Withdrawn. Not softened, not deferred. Withdrawn. Vivian kept her hands folded over a legal pad she did not write on. Her voice, when she spoke, was lower than usual and missing its old glide. I object to characterization that implies wrongdoing. Martin met her gaze without flinching. Your objection is noted. The withdrawal stands. Uncle Grant sat 2 seats down, tie slightly off-centre, and attempted his usual middle language. Let's all remember we're family first. No one answered him. The line had lost its usefulness now that the record had independent timestamps attached. My mother entered 3 minutes late, pearls and navy silk, and took her chair with unusual care, as if the room had narrowed overnight. She looked at me once, directly this time. I read the order, she said, and the corrected ledger. I waited. She had spent years turning away at the exact moment truth became inconvenient. Her pause held, then broke. Your father asked me twice why you kept pushing for source-level verification in estate drafts. I told him you were cautious. He said you were precise. Her hand moved to the packet edge and stopped there. I should have said that in this room long ago. It was not absolution. It was not repair. It was a statement entered late, but entered. I nodded once. Noted. The board observer, who had looked toward the camera angle on Summit Day, cleared his throat and asked to speak for the record. Martin granted it. The observer adjusted his glasses and kept his eyes on the table as he spoke. At the prior meeting, I observed that one principal stakeholder seat appeared outside the fixed recording frame. I did not raise it. I should have. He signed an addendum statement in ink and passed it down. Loaded look resolved, not by courage in the moment, but by belated admission on record. In family systems, that is often what accountability looks like at first. Thin, awkward, and finely written. We moved line by line through the court directives. Portal access, restored in full to both trust voters, effective 12:17 p.m. I logged in from my laptop at the table and confirmed live permissions. The governance administrator who had sent my restriction notice was on speaker by Martin's request. She confirmed reversal and archived both notices in the compliance folder. Risk advisory memo from Vivian's office, reclassified as advocacy communication, not governance finding, and appended with court order context to every recipient list, including outside directors. Daniel read the distribution verification aloud while the recorder ran. Every external contact from the last 24 hours now had an outcome attached to it. Then Martin opened the final packet, proposed interim operating structure, 2-signature rule for discretionary transfers, monthly source log attachments from independent forensics. Any exception requests to be filed simultaneously with both counsels. I added one line in plain language. All meeting recordings must include every voting principle in camera frame unless physical constraints are documented before call to order. Martin read it twice, then included it as Section 4C. A small clause maybe, but I had learned the architecture of erasure begins with small angles. Vivian finally spoke without looking up. Are we done performing? I answered in the same formal register the room had always demanded. We are done substituting performance for chronology. Her pen rolled off the table and struck the floor with a hard, narrow click. She did not bend to pick it up. At 3:06 p.m. we voted. The interim governance protocol passed unanimously, including Vivian's vote after a 10-second pause that felt longer because no one filled it. Martin announced adoption, time-stamped it, and directed distribution to court and bank forensics before close of business. He then turned to me with his careful counsel neutrality and said, Ms. Robinson, do you wish to make any further statement? I looked at the red recorder light, at the brass nameplates, at my father's portrait still stationed by the door, as if old authority could supervise the new record. I thought of the sealed file on the elevator ledge, the token cold in my palm, the courthouse door opening at 9:32, the moment Elaine said yes and the room changed because proof had entered. I thought of every time silence had been used against me, and of the day it stopped being a liability because I chose when to speak and what to prove. "No," I said. "I have what I need in the record." The meeting adjourned without ceremony. People stood, gathered folders, avoided unnecessary eye contact. Uncle Grant gave me a nod that asked for reconciliation he had not earned. I let it pass. My mother touched my sleeve once and then withdrew her hand before either of us translated the gesture into a promise. The board observer who filed the addendum left his pen behind. He came back for it and met my gaze long enough to show he understood why that mattered. I waited until the room emptied. The recorder light went dark. Through the glass wall, the private client floor moved in its usual choreography, discreet and expensive, as if no reckoning had occurred 2 levels above it. I stood at the centerline seat that had once been denied to me, closed my folder, and slipped the court-stamped order into my briefcase beside the duplicate evidence receipts. Silence was never weakness. It was discipline. And discipline with proof is authority. I didn't need my family's permission to be believed. I had the chronology, the record, and my own name, and that was enough.